Welcome to the interview. I'm Dr. Rick Waj. We have a special presentation for you. It's going to be in two parts. This is regarding Messiah, the time of Christmas, the Jewishness of this time of year, the Jewishness of when Messiah has come, maybe even when Messiah may be back again. We're all looking forward to that, but the first advent or the first coming of Messiah has been substantial in changing the world. And we want to talk about that with two of our guests today that we just love. They're part of the family here at Israel TV Network. They each have profound ministries that are affecting the planet. The first, we'll start off with our lady, which is Dr. Dina Dye from Foundations in Torah. Hello, Dina.
Shalom, Rick. How are you doing?
And shalom to you. And then our second guest, dear friend as well, is Reverend Gary Cristofaro from Ezra International. Hello, Gary.
Hello, shalom to all.
Shalom to you guys. Okay, we're going to get this started in our first session discussing this time of year that as Christians, we talk about this time of Christmas and maybe its effect, impact, maybe even some contradictions to the Jewishness that we look at when we look at Scripture. Go ahead, guys. Whoever wants to start.
Ladies first.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, obviously this has been the most transformational, influential event, on planet Earth in all of human history. But the importance is going back to me is looking at the scriptures from how they were written, like what was the writer trying to communicate? And lots of times we focus in on sort of the details, the information, but we forget that the writer had a purpose and interpretation himself in which he was trying to communicate. So clearly in scripture we have Matthew and Luke speaking of this event. And what's so interesting to me is what's missing. And they clearly did not want to tell us the date, right? There's some, and we'll probably talk about this as we get into this interview. But that information is not overtly there. So the question is, why did they leave it out? And then we have to look at, what is the backdrop? What is the historical, contextual, geographical, linguistic backdrop of those passages? And we seem to forget to do that. And so then, obviously the quote, the birth of the church, and as we move into the Roman rule, and things are influential in that regard. And then we come out with this date, December 25th, right? But clearly in scripture, we don't have that date there. So in order for us to try to understand, okay, what's really going on here? And is this something the writers want us to know? Should we be focused in?
Uh-oh.
Okay, so that was a dramatic session in just regarding the calendar and not being given specifically in Scripture. Gary, while we're waiting on Dina to come back, why don't you comment on that?
Yeah, I love what she said about the context and the what the intent was of the author. I've always said that if you don't know the intent or what it meant to the original audience, you don't really know what it means. It is interesting that there was no date ever given. And I think my theory on that is because this was never intended to be another feast or holiday that needed to be celebrated individually, because God gave us feasts of the feast of the Lord. In fact, we look at Leviticus 23, verse 2, and it doesn't say the Jewish feast. It says the feast of the Lord, or your feast of Yehovah. It's Yud-Heh Vav-Heh there. So the feast that we're to celebrate were given to us through Scripture, and therefore maybe the authors of these accounts, of the birth accounts, knew better than to set a date for another celebration, because it wasn't ordained by God. And that I'm commenting, and Dr. Daya, on what you said before we lost your connection, and maybe theorizing as to why the date wasn't given. Rick, did you have another question?
The only thing I was going to bring up is there are some scholars who believe, because of the order of the priesthood that's brought out in the Gospels, that this could be the time of Sukkot. Certainly, we probably would all agree that it's not December 25th.
Hmm. Yeah.
Well, and certainly all of the events in Scripture are connected to festivals. There's no denying that. You just look in the book of John, for example, virtually every chapter is a festival. So that's the backdrop, and it's important to understand the festivals. It makes the most sense for it to be at Sukkot, since the lambs are, so the sheep are still out to pasture, etc. And then he, of course, at Sukkot is standing in the court of the women and saying, I am the light of the world. And then we have this whole dialogue with Miriam and the light. So, logically, it tells us it looks like it's Sukkot, but clearly the writer didn't feel the need to tell us that. And maybe, Gary, you want to talk some too, because we know it tells us specifically that Zechariah was from the course or the order of Abiyah. And that's significant, especially if you go back and read in 1 Chronicles 24. So I don't know if we want to talk a little bit about why people do believe it took place at Sukkot based on that information.
Yeah, I know that that study has been done, and the months seem to work out from the time
Right.
that Zechariah was in and received the visitation and was told that Elizabeth would get pregnant, and it all does seem to point to a time of Sukkot, time of the fall festivals that Yeshua would have been born. I know that there's other theories. Some say that he was born at Passover. So, I don't think we'll ever know for sure until the resurrection. But I do think that I totally 100% agree with you that everything that God had done to that point, and we record, has been recorded in the Scripture, was done on an appointed time, the Moed or Moedim, the feasts of the Lord. And so I don't know why he would break that pattern. I love the patterns of God. He's so consistent to show us, that he has declared the end from the beginning. And so I think that absolutely it would have been a feast day.
Yeah, and I would just add to that as well, to both of what you said, and that is that it's also considered, Sukkot is considered the time of great joy, right? Which is
Yes.
one of the things that the angel heralds when he discusses this wonderful event that's about to take place.
Well, and certainly Israel, living in booths in the wilderness, and we see John starting out talking in the beginning, taking us right back to creation on purpose, by design, to tell us that, Yeshua was born and tabernacled among us. So that's we have lots of interesting connections. Of course, on the 8th day, which is the rejoicing in the Torah for the festival of Sukkot,
Yes,
Yeshua would have been circumcised.
exactly.
So clearly there's a lot there, a lot of patterns and connections. I guess what we all agree on is there's just no definitive way to prove it. But that makes more sense than sort of this date, December 25th, that's connected to the winter solstice in Rome and the Saturnalia and all these other things.
Yes. Yes. Now, maybe we should go into that a little bit now and talk about when we feel historically that the birth of Messiah was changed to be recognized on December 25th, its significance in the non-believing world, in the pagan world, and the pagan religions at that time, and why it, maybe if we can get into it, why it continues to be believed today.
Well, I think after 1,700 years, approximately, of indoctrination, the church has a hard time to break away from that. I look at it, and Dr. Dye just mentioned, Rome. Many people may not be familiar with the name Constantine, the Emperor Constantine, but if we look back and understand when Christianity in its current form was codified around 325 AD in the Council of Nicaea, a lot of these things were done in order to unify consolidate the power within the Roman Church and the Roman Empire. Thus, I believe the church, this is my personal opinion, the church was born in divorce of its Hebraic root, this form of Christianity. And it was done so to consolidate power. And I think Constantine basically committed the sins of Jeroboam. He said, don't go to Jerusalem. Don't celebrate those feasts. We're going to celebrate my special feast. We're going to put this, syncretism. We're going to make it this birthday the same as your pagan holidays or birthdays, and everybody will be happy under this one umbrella that we'll call Christianity. Now, I'm saying a lot here that can easily be researched. I'm not saying anything that anybody couldn't go online and look up. We're kind of skimming over that history, but this is easy to research and find where this change occurred.
Well, and we have to remember too, the backdrop here is Rome, the Roman Empire, the most powerful empire on the planet. And so a lot of this, I think, is political as well. Judaism was for all intents and purposes left alone by Rome. Since it was an older religion, Rome didn't really bother with it too much, but it did, target Christianity. And I think basically you tried to usurp and take control over the quote unquote religion. I don't care. I don't use that word in terms of our faith, but religion and politics, have gone together since the beginning of time. And so I think that effort by Rome to connect Christianity to its power structure was really, that's what governments and tyrants do, to basically wipe it off the map. And so now you can see nearly, 2,000 years, 1,800 years later, that worked pretty well, didn't it? Because for all intents and purposes, again, the church has forgotten its root. It's forgotten its foundation, that Yeshua was a Jew living in Israel, functioning within the context of a temple and of the ceremonies that went with the temple and its institution and all of that institutional life and the Torah. It managed to pull it right off its foundation.
And I would add to that, because the church has lost its foundation, its root, the historicity of its faith, then it has made it much easier for the world to slide into a paganistic view of the story of the birth of Messiah. And so we have snowmen and we have Santa Claus, which of course Saint Nick was an actual person. But we have this deification of things that have nothing to do with the original story of the birth of Messiah. Would you agree, both of you?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's just happened in history over and over and over again. Think about every time the Hebrew people went into exile. Everything was stripped away, and then they've got to start rebuilding. And they took little pieces of it, and they had something foundational to build on top of. But this is typical of how it always works. So it is a fight to get back to the foundation and to understand and to rebuild on that foundation.
Now, both of you speak in different churches. I know the pandemic has had some kind of an effect on how many churches and how many places that we can all speak in. But you both have seen the effect of bringing a Jewish message of the Gospels into church settings. How well is that received?
I guess it all depends on where you go. If there are pastors who are sensitive to this understanding, then it's there's a much better reception of the message. I have witnessed a resistance. I've seen eyes glaze over. I've seen anger. I've heard the statement or this phrase, "What's all this Jew stuff about?"
Mm-hmm.
Because there's been such a disconnect with our Hebraic roots that many people look at this as a challenge to their faith, and rather than something that would enhance and enrich their faith. But there are many. This is a movement. I think there's a movement afoot that people are coming back to their Hebraic roots. And in a moment, I'd love to share why I think that connection has been made, but I want to give Dr. Dye a chance to talk too.
Yeah, it's sort of a mixed thing, isn't it? It's a hit and miss at times. But so, being a Jew is a little more advantageous only in that people are willing to listen. Now, sometimes they do throw you out. I have been thrown out, but they're at least willing to entertain the possibility. But sometimes you just run into such incredible resistance that, and you try, through the Spirit, you try to figure out how can I communicate to this person, to break down all those walls that they have created. And really, sometimes it's almost impossible. But I think by and large, all around the globe, there's definitely a hunger and an interest because they've recognized that where they have arrived isn't working for them. They're not understanding the scriptures in a way they would like to. It's not meeting, the challenges of the day that they're involved in. So I think the door is, for the first time, really in 2,000 years, is opened in a way we haven't seen. And I think it's really exciting. And so we're taking full advantage of that.
Good.
Yeah.
I think go ahead, Gary.
I just love to say, because I think all that is true. There is an exciting time, and we need to take advantage of that. But I'd love to share why I think it's in our generation that we're seeing this. Since 1948, we've seen this huge influx, obviously, the Aliyah, the return of the Jewish people back to the land of Israel. And Jeremiah in the chapter 16 speaks something very interesting to me. When he talks about, first of all, that there'll come a day when no longer will the God of Israel be known as the God who brought them out of the land of Egypt, but he'll be known as the God who brought them out of the land of the north and all the nations that they've been scattered. That's the context of this prophecy. And then he goes on in verse 19 of Jeremiah 16 to say, the Gentiles will come and say, surely we have inherited lies, useless and unprofitable things. My personal opinion is that it's God's timing. When he reestablished Israel and started bringing back his people, there was also a move of his Spirit upon the hearts and minds of the Gentile world to say, whoa, wait a minute. We've inherited lies. Maybe our fathers and our grandfathers and so on didn't do this intentionally, but they had been taught one way and we inherited it. And now we're able to see the truth.
Right.
And so that, I believe, is why there's so many, rejecting replacement theology and then going even further and understanding our Hebraic root.
I agree. And, there's been discussion on the term, the fullness of the Gentiles, whether that means a number or it actually means a spiritual understanding. So we could get into that for a long period of time. I want to bring up a little story real quick and then ask you both a question. So when I was a young pastor, I remember the head of the deacons in that denomination that I served in came to me and really was yelling at me and saying, Jesus wasn't Jewish, he was a Christian. So when you look, here's the question then. So that was absurd, obviously. So here's the question for both of you. So when we look at the birth of Messiah, according to the Gospels, when we look at the early life of Yeshua, Gentiles would look at this event. Would they see it being a very Jewish event, according to Scripture, and why?
Are you saying when Gentiles read the Scripture, do they see any hint of?
Yeah, or actually, I'll qualify it by saying, when anyone reads the Scripture and they look at the gospel account of the birth and early childhood of Yeshua, do they see that being, is there hints of this being a very Jewish event and time in his life?
Well, here's the thing. Everybody has their own filters and biases. So if you're raised a certain way and that when you look out and perceive the world that way, that's going to be your filter. If you have no connection whatsoever to the ancient Hebraic culture, you're not going to see an ounce of it. So that when you approach the Scripture, you're going to take what you understand and insert it into the meaning of the Scriptures. And that's just a huge problem. So there's two things. Not only is there the Hebraic nature of what's going on, since it is culturally a Hebrew environment, but it's also an ancient Near Eastern environment. So that's foreign to Westerners as well. They have no understanding of the ancient Near East world. So you put those two together, you got a double whammy. And so then people are left with of interpreting the scriptures based on their own knowledge base from whence they came. And that's true of anybody, anybody approaching the scripture. I mean, I would say even quote unquote a secular Jew who's been raised in the West, who's lost their connection to their foundation, would do exactly the same thing. So for me, and my goal in my ministry is to take us back. Okay, what did the culture look like at the time? What's ancient Near East thinking? How did the Jewish people function within that environment, to start to unpack what these things meant? And one of the most basic elements in all this, I would say, is understanding the role of creation, because we don't even understand that. And so we put it in its scientific environment, but it was never meant to be. It was meant to be an environment which would come a king who would rule over the world and bring peace and restoration. It's not so much about, how many years it took to create this, that, and the other. It's a story of kingship. And so that, for me, becomes my filter in which how I see all of these things tying together. But that requires research and study. And I'm afraid people just don't do enough of that.